Hello and welcome to Spirit Plant Medicine. My name is Marc Caron, and today's another pre-conference episode of our program. And today I'm really happy to introduce our guest, one of our sponsors, and just a gentleman who's been a great advocate of the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference over the years. And his name is Robert Laurie. Now, Robert's an award-winning international lawyer with qualifications from England and an admission to the British Columbia Bar. Robert's legal practice is centered on various aspects of commercial business, governmental affairs, regulatory matters, as well as charter and constitutional issues related to cannabis and psychedelic plant medicines. With an extensive experience in policy development, corporate, commercial, and administrative law, as well as licensing, regulations, and constitutional matters pertaining to medical cannabis and psilocybin access, Robert is dedicated to reforming drug laws in Canada. In his role as a legal practitioner in Canada, Robert actively works towards the improvement of medical patient access to cannabis, psychedelics, and sacred plant medicines, while also striving to enhance drug laws for the betterment of society. As a consultant, he crafts innovative regulatory strategies, government policies, and business solutions for global companies operating in the regulated food, cannabis, and psychedelic industries. He also serves as a board advisor to the esteemed organizations such as the Psychedelic Association of Canada and the Last Prisoner Project. He has also previously collaborated with MAPS Canada, and furthermore, Robert provides advisory support to the Heroic Hearts Project and has contributed to the establishment of the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. He also plays a role as the director for the Ecuador Amazon Restoration Project, and his commitment to his work is exemplified through his tireless advocacy as a lawyer, working diligently to expand medical treatment options for anxiety, depression, addiction, and PTSD by facilitating improved access to cannabis, psychedelics, and sacred plant medicines, and advocating for more progressive drug laws. Robert, welcome to the program. Always a pleasure to see you and have some dialogue because, I know you've been doing such great work. Primarily, it started in cannabis and, from the plant medicine side and is, morphed into psychedelics and plant medicine. So welcome to the show and congratulations on the award you won as one of the top cannabis lawyers around.
Thank you, Mark. It's an absolute honor to be here. And thank you for reading every single word of my bio. That was awesome. I think I should have said to you, use snippets as appropriate, right? Because I'm very fortunate. I get to speak at a lot of different events. And of course, the audience and the topics sometimes range. But anyways, you definitely covered the whole spectrum. And
well, I had to, Rob, because I had to, because there's so much in there that I think is important. So instead of missing something like I did in 2020,
that was something. No, you were great.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we cover what you do extensively because, you're not just a lawyer, you're not just in cannabis, but you've done a lot of work within plant medicines, you're working with MAPS, working with Indigenous people, not just locally, but around the world. So for me, it's important to make sure that we cover that in the work that you do.
Thank you. Well, it's definitely been an interesting journey. And, we were talking before the show, sort of looking at, I think it was 2016 was the first time that I came to Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. And I was pretty heavy for a number of years in the cannabis space, but sort of taking a step over and looking at this whole other area involving plant medicines, which, whether you like it or not, cannabis is definitely a plant medicine. But of course, its relationship throughout history and connection to a whole other plethora of plants, from the fungi kingdom, the plant world, the looking at too what we're seeing being done in labs, as well as, natural and botanical extractions. And it's a very interesting time. So for me, as I told you before the show, by putting on Spirit Plant Medicine, for me was like stepping into a whole nother world, which, I have to credit you very much because really within the little universe or community that the conference attracts. It really opened my eyes, my heart, and my practice to a much wider area. And for that, I'm forever grateful. And I think that accounts for a lot of the reason for why I'm here today and continue to participate or attend Spirit Plant. But I've been, of course, able to participate in varied roles over the years as an advisor and a sponsor, and very honored to be a part of what you do, Marc. So thank you.
Hey, well, it's our pleasure as well, Rob, because I know your work is very well received, and you've done some great work, especially in Canada. And one of the things I find interesting, we're going to talk about, the law and psychedelics and plant medicines, and we're also going to answer, I'm going to ask you the question that is kind of our fundamental question for our pre-conference things. But just to touch on kind of what you were saying earlier, is I find it really interesting is now cannabis is legal in Canada, how it's changed, because there was all the medical dispensaries that were on the edge of the law and really probably, I would imagine, running illegally. And then when it became legal, all of a sudden the medicinal side is not as regarded or promoted from a public point of view versus the recreational side. So I thought, that was something that quite interesting in regards to, just the way cannabis has changed.
Definitely. I mean, it was 15 years of advocacy, advocacy and litigation, which John Conroy calls the litany of litigation, which, arguably started with the R.V. Parker case, which was Ontario Court of Appeal, leading all the way up to the Smith and Allard decisions in about 2013, 14. 14, 15, which ultimately led to legalization of cannabis in 2018. And you're right, it really was, again, on the backs of medicinal access, which, we did take a page from California, which, again, a lot of people may or may not recall that the case for cannabis leading back, 30 something years ago to when the BC Compassion Club Society started. Again, a lot of this was totally, they were tolerated and permitted because the access and the compassion they were providing, really had grown out of the AIDS crisis, which was very serious. And that and cancer have always played a very important role in regard to patients and there being, a fundamental constitutional right thereof of access. So we get to a lot of an amazing work and litigation by, lawyers like John Conroy and Kirk Tusaw and Jack Lloyd. And, I was involved a little bit towards the end with the Vancouver dispensary test case where, we basically ran at the government with arguments that the proposed municipal licensing and the backdrop with the federal legalization really was exclusive of medical access. Here we are, allowing and permitting recreational access, and yet medical patients still are a secondary consideration. And before we, go too far down and off topic, the cannabis government response to the consultation process, which everyone in the industry has been waiting for, which is, again, looking at the consultation of the review of the Cannabis Act. And the report came out the other day, and the table of contents, interestingly enough, has, 12, 13 chapters, more or less. Indigenous, I think, are at chapters 5 and 6. Dealing with the illicit market is chapter 11, I believe. And chapter 12, or bringing up towards the end, is medical patients. And I would argue that that is probably the scale or the liquidity or the importance by which the federal government is looking at these issues. So, again, cannabis and medical access got us to recreational access. people rushed into recreational access thinking that it would be the new green gold rush. And in some cases it has been, for some folks, but a lot of our good majority have come out of the hills broke with nothing to show for it. And yet the black market has continued to exist. The indigenous market has risen, or an independent market, or two indigenous markets. You have the Section 119 applicants who are legal, and then you have sovereigntists who have opened stores under, band council and laws on reserve. And on top of that, you have the legal market, which you could call the green market. And folks are really not doing well in this commercial cannabis. I mean, the price of cannabis has dropped, which I expected and anticipated. I mean, I can tell you a story about that later, but that really brings us to where I believe that, it will be medical access that will always be the pillar or the bastion by which this industry, the recreational industry, will be tied to one way or another, because this is where I guess the rubber hits the road. Medical patients have constitutional protections, whereas non-medical recreational commercial purposes have no constitutional protection. So even though you could have a pissed off sector of the legal industry getting screwed by the government on a regular basis, they would have a very difficult time. And in fact, a group of retailers who are claiming that the BC government was not enforcing against indigenous and other illicit, let me rephrase that, indigenous operators operating without a government license and illicit black market operating. They basically claim that the government owed them a duty of care, which the government doesn't. They really have to just show that they are enforcing the law to the best of their abilities. It would be impossible to be able to go after everybody. Engaging in some degree of selective enforcement is, again, justified on budgets and so on. So really, I think what we're going to see, and we'll talk about this definitely later, is the process is definitely still evolving. But you're right. We seem to have forgotten the medical, and we're going to be returning to it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. This is where we'll circle back to shortly, where we're seeing psychedelics and plant medicines like the mushrooms kind of taking that same pathway as what we're seeing locally here in Vancouver and in some of the bigger cities across Canada. But before we get going there, because I think we'll be able to tie it all in with the answer to our fundamental question for these pre-conference programs, is, Rob, what do you see as the role of plant medicines and psychedelics at this time of rapid change and uncertainty in the world today?
Is that before or after the Israeli-Gaza conflict? Because ultimately that situation that we found ourselves witnessing from afar to some degree, I think would suggest that, plus these other conflicts such as Ukraine and anything else where people are either losing lives and incurring and witnessing traumatic events, ultimately psychedelics will need to play a role at some point in reconciling how we deal with these traumatic and complicated situations. And I guess the Israeli-Palestine conflict is quite interesting in that I can't see how, with it looking like a zero-sum game, that you have Hamas, who doesn't view a two-party state, who for them only victory will be the eradication of the Israeli nation state. And on the other hand, you have Israel, which again has, done what they have done. I'm trying to choose my words very carefully. However, given now the fallout of this conflict on either side, there are no winners with war at the end of the day. And as we're seeing, psychedelic therapy and access to psychedelics may be, in some of these cases, perhaps the only feasible relief that some of these folks may possibly be able to get down the road. The interesting thing is we're definitely seeing an increase in Canada of both what you could call perhaps regulated psychedelic therapy, which is being done under auspices of a number of groups that have an informal, almost like a trade association and rules and ethics, which that population more or less monitors themselves very strictly for fear of, mistakes that will put their progress back. And then on the other hand, you have illegal, illicit underground providers that probably aren't going to get training or regulated anytime soon. And within that class, you've got really the good, the bad, and the ugly. So regardless of that, you're seeing an increase of access to these medicines. And well, if it wasn't needed before, given a global pandemic and the fallout with that and the rise of what we saw of very racialized politics in the United States, and again, the radicalizing of police against persons of color, right? That was what I was saying 2 years ago, with more or less is the same thing, but now the stakes are higher, right? And if Hezbollah looks to join this conflict, and that then brings in these other nations, I think, if the doomsday clock literally was 90 seconds to midnight, which no joke, that's what there's a measurement of how close we as a civilization are to extinction. And it was 90 seconds to midnight, which was certainly maybe around the last Ukraine conflict. But now with this heightened escalation, I sort of see that, without psychedelics, we're at a point of no return. And I mean, the psychedelics are probably that and a hell of a lot of therapy and so on is what will be needed to try to facilitate and reconcile what's going on in that camp or those camps. And just look at how any notice of local news has been completely displaced by what is going on with that conflict. And I think more and more people, like even my wife was just like, can you tell me about this conflict? Like, I don't really know anything about it. And I'm like, the extent to which this conflict is to what it is going to permeate the domestic policy of every country in the world, which has a diaspora population of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews. So, if there was not a case now for the use of looking at psychedelics to at least try to bridge some gaps in understanding, I don't know when would be. But here we are, then, less than 90 seconds to doomsday.
It's just crazy. And, war never makes sense to me to begin with, regardless of the reasons or whatever's behind that. So I can see how psychedelics, especially for PTSD, anxiety, stress, and trauma, can certainly be helpful kind of during and after the
where psychedelics are so needed. I was watching just some news.
And that was you're about to answer my question, which is exactly that, is like, how else can these medicines be helpful in regards to maybe avoiding these things in the future and, as we move through them?
Well, I just saw, and this is, sorry to jump in, but, it answers your question, which, there's issues now going on in the U.S. Senate and Congress about companies that are now getting contracts like Lockheed. Their stock's gone through the roof because, again, these are companies that are getting awarded government contracts now to deal with the Israeli conflict. And war profiteering is something that I think is going to continue, and it's terrible. But perhaps that is, again, where some of these CEOs and executives that, again, are involved in this military industrial complex that is now going to profit on record levels like we haven't seen before. I mean, if anything, those are the people that should be confronting their actions with psychedelic therapy. And I think that would certainly opened their eyes as to the harm to which they are proliferating and the undue proliferation of arms and munitions and acts of violence is only going to increase. So to me, if you were to sort of sit down, who's driving this bus, it's going to be those folks that I think need to be confronted with this medicine one way or another in order to truly see the horrific impact of what they're doing. And that just caught my mind today, which is like, my God, war profiteering, the stock market, the American economy, and where does that lead us?
Yeah, well, it reminds me of a post I saw maybe 2-3 years ago, and it was somebody, it was, like a meme, and it was a joke, yet it was serious, where they believe all the world leaders should really be sitting down in a circle with, in ceremony with ayahuasca or some sort of, plant medicine that would bring them to, a deeper connection with self, spirit, and source even. And it was just an interesting concept that many people believe that should be something that happens, because I think the world would definitely be a much different place if a lot of these world leaders could get out of their heads into their hearts and see things from a different perspective. And that's one of those things that the medicines do help with.
I mean, lines and divisions are even more pronounced now than they were this time last week. And it was already pretty, at a point, and now we've just pushed past that. So, we're at a very interesting point in history, and hopefully psychedelics can play a greater role than
it always blows
what we're seeing.
I agree. And it always blows my mind, with the amount of intelligence, wisdom, resources, information that this world has today, which could be debated as more than we've ever had in the history of mankind, that we could still be at war with each other and still at this place of unrest and unease and disputes, when I happen to believe that everybody wants peace in some way, shape, or form. And I think it starts with mastering our own inner peace, and then how we show up in the world. But how we have conflict like we have today that is so destructive, it just always blows my mind with the amount of intelligence and wisdom that is, the world's full of right now. So it is something that I always find quite shocking. Everybody wants peace, but we still seem to go to war for what appears to be, almost well, let's just say there are reasons I don't understand, and probably reasons most people don't understand when it comes.
Well, if the same people can turn on the taps and turn off the taps with regards to global affairs and socio-political and economic affairs, well, perhaps it's part of the strategy. It just seems that things, regardless of how much internal peace you have, the external factors and who are in charge of a lot of this process seem to be, at least from what I'm seeing, are bending or modifying their will and attention towards the will of, it seems more and more of unelected groups and officials who are, again, having access to the corridors of power, which in turn is leading to domestic policy, which you're struggling to see, how does this have anything to do with what's needed at home with the problems and the situations here? So, again, psychedelics, hopefully we can turn this around. But my greatest fear is things, unfortunately, I think are going to get worse before they get better. And again, if we can make it better now, why aren't we?
Yeah, that's a great question that I think comes down for a whole nother show. So, you talk about what we could do at home and what's happening at home. Let's talk about psychedelics, plant medicines, and the law. And let's spin that around so we can talk about what we can do and what people should know about the law, especially in Canada, because you're a Canadian guy, but you're also well versed in a lot of international situations. But we originally were talking about cannabis and how the medical stuff and on the legal side and then becomes legal and it's all focused on recreation. Now we're seeing the same kind of pattern happen with plant medicines and mushroom dispensaries here in Vancouver. And I know there's some on the streets in Toronto and other
Yeah,
parts of Canada. And as well as there's been a big movement down in the US and in the San Francisco, Oakland area, Denver, all about this decriminalization.
yeah.
What's happening there and what do people need to know about what's legal, what's not illegal?
All right. If you're
What
buying any kind of psychedelic on the street from a vendor, chances are it's probably illegal, like textbook legal law definition, criminal code, Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, possession, trafficking, and so on. However, given everything that's going on, including what we discussed earlier, all of these larger problems, issues like mushrooms and small amounts and possession for personal use, and again, you're seeing this sort of proliferation of online operators and brick and mortar retail stores. And that's before you even look at and consider what's going on some of these different indigenous reservations where, there's full on cannabis smoke shop and like cigarettes, but you're starting to see mushrooms and a few other things popping up in that. And you ask, well, why? Well, it really, I think, comes down to the fact that things are so bad, resources are very slim. The medical system does not have readily available solutions for other than perhaps the traditional psychotherapy and by attending counseling with a psychiatrist or psychologist. I mean, to see a psychiatrist these days, even if with means, you're probably looking at a year to 2 year wait list in Vancouver. Psychologists, maybe it varies, but people are finding that, well, we're hearing news and we're hearing about breakthroughs at Johns Hopkins and, groups like Heroic Hearts who are, again, helping vets connect with psychedelic operators in order to, again, deal with their severe PTSD and other considerations and the like. And I think, well, people are again, they're reading in the news about how difficult it is for groups that are trying to do things as legal as possible, the Theracils of the world and other groups. But, to get through those hoops could take weeks, months, even years. And even in the cases of the medical patients who've been granted Section 56 exemptions for psilocybin or access to that therapy through the special access program, they're still finding that, the government is still rejecting and not renewing many of those authorizations, which is leading to a huge opportunity for the unregulated illicit market to continue to provide that. And the law certainly is a little bit blurred with some other substances such as acid and MDMA, for example. And I guess you could go cocaine on there and, methamphetamine. Those are all been substances that, at least in British Columbia, are now under a Section 56 federal and provincial exemption for possession for amounts no greater than 2.5 milligrams. And that's all been done and designed really as a means for the government to reverse some of the course with the drug war, namely to reduce stigma and make it not so, I guess, stigmatizing for people and their medicine. And the reality of it is, before, people who are using their drugs in the back alleys are just now doing it in front of the buildings, right? So it's in plain view, and what was a back alley problem is a front street problem, and no one has addressed safe supply. But amongst that psilocybin in these mushroom stores, the law is very much illegal that, even possession of psilocybin could get you in trouble under the criminal law. And there is no defined amount like there is for the other substances named for possession, which also on top of that, without a safe supply, is this really leading people in the right direction? Or is it still rendering vulnerable people, stuck in a predatory situation where they're still buying their supply from folks who are perhaps doing it for means other than medical patient compassionate access? So these stores, I'm sure, are making a profit. They're taking a risk. And again, I think we're going to see a lot more pop up just because the city of Vancouver, for example, could have taken the 10 stores to court yesterday, because they do have jurisprudence to rely upon and, involving the dispensary test case. But I think their strategy is they're going to let the number build. Now, whether that's 25 stores, 50 stores, 100 stores, who knows? But you can guarantee that once people's children start getting into like mushroom edibles or gummies and start going to emergency rooms, or these stores or there's allegations of teens and vulnerable populations getting these substances, I think you'll see an amnesty, which is probably the only way to describe the situation. You'll see that amnesty go from, tolerated behavior, and people that operate outside that unwritten understanding, will probably be subject to regulatory and, good old law enforcement at that point. But until that point, I think we're going to see more of the same, because let's face it, government have bigger problems to deal with when it comes to crime, public safety, and public health than a mushroom store.
Well said there. And I think it's an interesting difference too, as well, when you take a look at plant medicines versus, something like a cocaine, meth, these other, the fentanyl crisis that we see here in Vancouver, versus a plant-based medicine. I know Dennis McKenna and I always kind of ask the questions like, it's nature. How does that become illegal when people have been, eating these things naturally for years, or consuming cannabis and using hemp for, eons from the beginning of time? Right?
I'd love to see coca legalized. I mean, at the end of the day, the coca leaf has been used for centuries, if not longer, in various regions of Latin America and South America. Again, the medicinal properties, I think, could burden and relieve the overburdens of the public health system. I mean, look at the overdependence on prescription drugs, which, again, growing and producing coca leaf for use as you would in traditional settings, I think, I've got nothing but good things to say about that. I mean, I know when I was in Peru, I was certainly making use of the coca that was available. You'd put stuff
it's a powerful medicine. The Peruvians and been consuming this in the Andes forever. And I remember Wade Davis said, the coca leaf is no more cocaine than a potato is vodka.
Well, right? No, here's the, I was about to quote that as well, and forgive me, but my recollection, the exact words were, what is it? Coca is to cocaine to what potatoes are to vodka. We regulate the vodka, and we, regulate the potato, which becomes the vodka. How in this age, when, again, we don't have infrastructure in place, which goes back to a lot of my motivation and why I'm involved in this space, is these are bad laws. This is, again, these medicines are really our birthright. They are, I think, an inherent tradition of which has been denied to us starting in the 1920s with opium and cannabis and the efforts that were brought there, leading up to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Framework, which at the height or 1971, which is again where a number of these traditional ceremonial plant medicines for the first time in history became criminalized, which really to me is something that we all need to look at, that despite the underground and the advancements with these medicines, and even with legalized cannabis in Canada, legalized recreational cannabis, that in and of itself is still illegal under the international framework, the Controlled Drugs and Substances framework, which Canada finds itself. So as exciting as things are, and again, I loved living in the Lower Mainland, Vancouver, Western Canada. You mentioned California and the other states, that yes, there is this decriminalization, but I don't think you're seeing what you're seeing in the unregulated circles in Canada. And Western Canada has always been very much a pioneer in the space, and I think it really continues to do and will continue to do so.
Why do you think that is, Rob? I've been asked this question before as well. Why do you think that the West Coast and Western Canada is maybe lenient or tolerant?
You ready for it? Vancouver is the end of the line. It's the end of the road when you think about it, right? You got Eastern Canada, where the power is pretty much focused. Western Canada, which is again a resource-based, economy, versus Eastern Canada. So really, Vancouver's the end of the road when it comes to Canada and so on. But at the end of the road, that's the gateway to the East. So this is interestingly enough where Eastern and Western philosophies collide. Also, because of this, and very much a frontier spirit that I'm very much proud of my fourth generation British Columbia heritage, which we were the Wild West to some degree, and with that, it's always attracted an interesting population. With that, on top of it, Indigenous who were here before everybody. And then you add to it the rich cultures from Asia and India, Chinese, and India. On top of it, with all the draft dodgers, right? Which is ultimately why British Columbia is BC bud. Weed is not from British Columbia per se. It came here through a huge migration, primarily of draft dodgers from places like Colorado. And prior to that, you had massive migration with the mining and the resources. And with that, that brought people from all over the world with the gold rush. And on top of that, the railway. So really Vancouver, and this is really summed up nicely in the Greenpeace documentary, how to start a mind bomb, where really, that's why Greenpeace formed as it did, was really out of this crucible of like fishermen, Indigenous, Asians, counterculture, hippies, draft dodgers, the West having a very different attitude regarding resources and control and exploitation by the East. So, very much, I think it just ties into the frontier spirit. And because we really are the last outpost before, you're dealing with Americans to the south, Asia to the east, and technically, back in the old days, Russia was right there with Alaska. So in many ways, I think we're regulated quite tough, but that's because without that way of sort of doing things and vice, you have to remember Vancouver has always been a city of vice. Let's not forget, the opium dens and the beer parlors of China in Chinatown. And our first mayor in Vancouver was Gassy Jack. Well, Gassy Jack's famous for basically opening the first city hall, which was the bar. He was a bartender serving whiskey. I think, what did it say? It was like, if you build a bar, I'll serve whiskey out of it. And, that is the start of our town. So really, I think that plus, the rough and tumble nature, which over some generations, we've certainly become a lot more civilized. But, I think that is the answer to your question.
Well, thanks for that, Rob.
BC
Certainly
has always been really I'm born and bred here, and I asked my dad that, and my dad would always say Vancouver is a very difficult place to make money. People who have money have made their money somewhere else, and they've moved to Vancouver for quality and choice of lifestyle. So again, it's that end of the road frontier spirit, which is really caters to a very interesting, choice of folk who come here and call the Pacific Northwest home.
Well, we certainly do have a very large conscious community here in Vancouver, and trailblazers, like you say, just talking about the draft dodgers and the people coming up from the 60s San Francisco. So I have to imagine that that did have something to do with it as well. Never thought of going back into the history even more in terms of that, but
Quakers and pacifists. I mean, that was the huge influence on Greenpeace. It was a group of Quaker lawyers, basically, who, Greenpeace used to meet at the Unitarian Church on Burrard. And that's why we're called, Greenpeace, because they couldn't fit the name Greenpeace or with a space, green and peace on the button. So it was Greenpeace. So in any event, there's a lot of unique history. And by another little side note, the first international office the DEA opened outside of the United States beyond Medellin, Colombia, is Vancouver, Canada. There's other offices now, but back in the day, maybe about during when there was Mark Emery in the Vancouver 3, that extradition case. Oh yeah, the DEA had an office. So again, underneath this sort of history of Vancouver, Olympic town, and we're all healthy and do yoga and protect the environment, there is definitely an underbelly of vice, which, folks don't like to talk about, but it's there and it's never gone away. And I think there's just a greater tolerance for supply and demand economy, provided though people are not getting harmed and there isn't exploitation.
Very interesting. So then let's circle back to, psychedelics and the law. Because of this movement, the psychedelic renaissance that's happening, so many people are becoming more and more interested in ceremony or doing the work with, say, psilocybin or MDMA. Even cannabis and meditation is a very different thing. What would you say to these people who are looking at these plant medicines, even, ayahuasca, wachuma, peyote, whatever that might be? What would you say to people who are looking for this, maybe from the underground providers versus the clinical providers? What are the things they need to be aware of and consider when they start making decisions to do this kind of work for themselves?
It's an excellent question, and I'll do my best to answer. And again, nothing I say is legal advice or a best practice here, but I think you really need to ask yourself the question, why are you coming to these medicines? And if it's because Will Smith did it, or, your friends think it's cool and it's a trendy thing, which annoyingly it's become more trendy, which I think takes away from the solemnity and the sacredness of these medicines and ultimately the power of the wisdom and the knowledge that I guess they bestow. So, for me, I've always come to them with the intention of trying to learn more about myself and, why specifically I do things the way I do, and to get clarity around that. And I've been very lucky. I mean, if you're a lawyer, some of it is, some of that really helps with learning and attracting the right people in the space. I mean, again, when you are sort of picking a name out of the phone book or a name off of a web page or a recommendation from somebody that heard this is a good referral, it's very difficult to know what are they and who are they and what do they represent and what is their experience. I mean, those are all questions I would be asking. Importantly would be, who did you study under? And I've been very lucky that, the times and the events that I've engaged in psychedelics, they have been, almost with the named forefather or, godfather or godmother, if you will, for that substance. So, for me, I've been very lucky to be able to connect and engage with these medicines and probably in as authentic experiences as you possibly can. Now, others are not so lucky. And that's where I have stressed folks like Dennis McKenna, that this would be a good initiative for the McKenna Academy. I mean, they've certainly been moving in these directions. But again, how do you know a certain provider is good and reputable, right? There are no real standards, if you will. I mean, there's the North Star Pledge and other unofficial guidelines, but in any event, you don't know what you could be getting into. So I think you really have to do your research. But ultimately, it comes to, why are you coming to these medicines? And, psychedelics are just part of the equation. The beautiful thing about it is they will show you, and this is to quote Dennis McKenna, the plant medicines will not necessarily show you what you want, but they will show you what you need. And what they have to offer isn't always crimson and clover and sunshines and rainbows and Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. No, it can be some really nasty, revealing, dark, deep, issues about yourself or your situation that you have been either too ignorant to acknowledge or become aware of. But really, I think the role that these medicines play and why you need to do this in right environments is they kind of lay out the playbook. They show you, hey, here's who you are and who you think you are. And you see that gap. And ultimately, the more you do these psychedelics as part of a regimen, right? You wouldn't want to do psilocybin or acid every day if you're doing these things properly under therapeutic, under therapeutic environments. But really, it's the start. And I can say personally that it was December 12th, December 20th, because it was December 12th, like we received the decision in the test case. And I mean, I was pretty beat down, hurt, depressed. I mean, I just got the shit kicked out of me by the Chief Justice and the legal system. And it was not a good time, but it was a time that I embraced psychedelics. And I can remember my first deep dive was, for me, really, it was like a trial. It was a birth, a death, a second coming, and almost a coronation of the divinity within. But it highlighted for me like where I was failing personally, professionally. I mean, as a dad and as a partner, all of these issues that I guess I was not leaning into and addressing with the mindfulness and the intention that they deserved. Well, the universe was getting that back into alignment. And I think the good news is that, again, the more you do this as part of a plan that involves counseling, therapy, diet, exercise, a peer group, it's a means to help you, I think, address what's going on and build strategies to move on from there. But there is no shortcut. I mean, I think back to the psychedelic experiences over the last 5 years, and there's been times like, it's just, wow, where do you go from here and what do you do? But there always is tools and insight, and it's up to you whether to act on them. And, that to me is where I've been lucky. So, look, if it comes down to making a decision, feel free to reach out. There are people within the plant medicine space. I've always been very lucky. I've been able to approach most people and get greater clarity And I think it's important to realize that, I don't know everything. I don't claim or profess to. And again, neither should you if you're new in the space. Ask questions and come to events like the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. I mean, for me, I must have gone to 2 or 3 plant medicine shows over the course of a number of years before I even did deep dives. So for me, it was like, if I'm going to do this, and this is going to be a significant part of my life, then I'm going to do it properly. And I'm so blessed to be able to do this work professionally, which at the same time has been so essential in helping me to grow and develop as a person, a professional, and as a member of the community. So,
Well, I really thanks, Rob, because I think you brought up some of the probably the most key fundamental points. Set and setting and integration is super important. It's, you can have the best, wake up, the best aha, the best download, but if we don't incorporate that and integrate it into our lives, well, then what did we do it for, right? And I think it's what you're saying as well, just to affirm, do your research, find out who you're working with, who you're sitting with, the medicine that you're doing, and do it right. So many people I've seen throughout stories, throughout personal experience, and you even see it in the movie Dosed with Adrienne the first time she's going to go sit with, I believe it was Iboga and such. People will lie about their addictions or their preparation or whatever that is. And it's very important to, be truthful and to do your work around.
People die with psychedelics. Yeah. Like, I think the difference with cannabis, unless, you take cannabis and drink and then engage in a dangerous activity or an accident happens, but generally people don't die. Cannabis is pretty forgiving and benevolent, but psychedelics, on the other hand, name your pick. Too much can be, it can be catastrophic especially if the individual is not prepared and have no awareness for what is happening. I mean, there have been times where I've been like, holy Christ, did I just go too far or take too much that I might not come back? But then that's ultimately where you're like, okay, let's get our breath, let's do our breathing. And in many ways, psychedelics are as serious as I look at it, almost like, how I imagine Chuck Yeager stepping into a cockpit looking to break the sound barrier. If you're not physically or mentally attuned and aware of what you're about to go into, and, again, have done the preparation, chances are you're going to, it'll feel like a psychedelic burnout. And, to me, that was very much how I approached ayahuasca. Even on the day was like, we're going up, we're going to be, again, in an environment that's new. Being a psychedelic, psychedelic test pilot was basically, looking at what does a test pilot go through? And again, systems check. How are we feeling? What's going through our minds, right? The journaling, the entries. Have we eaten properly? We prepared properly? What is the mission? Why are we engaging with these medicines? And so for me, I don't know, I've always had sort of this, like, for me, I've always wanted to get my pilot's license, and I've been studying towards it. So for me, again, the reverence I have for this is the same reverence I would have for operating an aircraft. And in many ways, this, when you take psychedelics, it does feel like you are trying to master a supersonic craft of some sort, and you're at the middle of it. And again, I think also reading a lot of Chris Hadfield helped me, because again, learning to make your world smaller, which is your mind in psychedelics could end up going off in all these directions, causing panic. And I can remember, just to conclude on one instance, I remember it was probably my second deep dive. I got mad at the universe. And it was like, why have you given me these character faults where I talk too much? And, I jump into situations, and I sometimes, act before I think, and so on. And, and really just started breathing and let what was about to happen unfold. And I always remember what Dennis says is surrender, submit. You can't fight these. Why
surrender's
try
the
to
word
fight it?
there, right? Yeah,
Surrender, especially if you're looking at a 5-MeO DMT experience, which, this is coming on like a sonic boom, versus when you drink ayahuasca. I mean, that literally is sort of brewing slowly like a logging truck gearing up a hill, or, and then boom, it just sort of hits. So again, being aware of what you're going to experience and how you're going to react. And that's again why I think some of these providers, like, I hear horror stories about things that go on in like places like Arrhythmia, which, nothing against them, but to me, when I'm hearing that they're doing like 100 people a night, right? There's 100 people taking ayahuasca. To me, that I would not want to do ayahuasca in an airport departure lounge. That's kind of what that would feel like with that many people. So
well,
really,
100 people is, yeah, that's bizarre.
like, to me, that just seems like they're cranking the numbers through. And but again, courses for courses. But again, I think you have to be careful, because again, if you're going to other countries like Mexico or Peru, Jamaica, right, to do these medicines, you are subject to local law. They don't give a shit that you're Canadian at the end of the day. So, if you get caught in a situation like, say, Mexico, and you have on your possession, or you're involved with people, you could very well be in a lot of trouble. So again, knowing who you're dealing with, what their track record is, knowing people that have done their ceremony and speak highly of it is key. Because look, if you're going to invest your money, that's one thing, but you're investing literally your soul and your mental health with dealing with these medicines. So if those stakes weren't high enough, or if they weren't encouraging people to take this serious for what they are, then I don't know what would.
Well, I think you said something that I think a lot of people don't actually consider, and I didn't consider it until you actually just mentioned it now. It's like when you're traveling, because a lot of people do go to other countries to experience these medicines and the ayahuasca tourism, whether it be, ayahuasca or mushrooms or whatever that may be, that you're under the laws of another country as well, not just your own country. And that's something that really needs to be considered, where I've never heard anybody really, kind of address that or talk about that in their own course of their journeys. So I think it's something that's certainly important to consider. Absolutely. And surrender, that key word that always comes up on so much of the work I've done, is to surrender to the medicine, and to let it do its work without your own resistance. Because in the end, some might say that's just the ego getting in the way, right?
And the ego does get in the way, unfortunately, or fortunately. At least being aware of that is half the battle. And I know there were many years I wasn't even aware of that, or had the appreciation for how the impact that actions have on other people and situations. And that was, just to conclude, one of the things that really summed things up. The end of the day, it was like, wow, it's been me who's been fucking my situation up. It's been me who's been dealing with things in a way that's been leading to perhaps why I'm here at this situation or at this predicament.
And well, in our life, there's always that one common denominator in everything we do in our life, right? And that is ourselves.
So that, to me, is what was the greatest gift of the psychedelics, really, was realizing, like, hey, you have to take responsibility for your actions, and the only one that's going to get you out of or beyond or moving towards the goals and the life you want or the career is yourself. I mean, there'll be no shelter here, to steal a line from Zach De La Roche. Rage Against the Machines, which really at the end of the day, there is no backup. You're going to have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. The good news is the medicines, if done in the right circumstances with the right intentions and the setting and environment, plus the necessary follow-up and integration, and as well having a peer group to support what you're doing, again, it can lead to new outcomes, and again, those new outcomes lead to new rewards, new challenges, and new strategies. So to me, I guess the piece that I want to impart is that these medicines definitely are a gateway into new ways of looking at the world, looking at yourself, but they have to be revered and taken seriously because they are powerful. And I think there's a reason for why throughout history, it was only the shamans, the medicine men, the priests, the matriarchs, the elders, the medicine women, who the certain segments within the tribe, the band, or the society would be responsible for engaging in these medicines. I'm forever grateful, though, that I live in a time and a place where instead of the village priest, it is me, the individual, who gets to engage in these medicines. And really, I think the reason why they are restricted the way they are is because without them, how can an individual better know thyself, right? And if you realize the divinity or the divine resides within, I mean, Rumi says, if I am a drop in the ocean, and the ocean is a drop of me, there is a universality, which, no bullshit, you hear all that sort of talk with psychedelics, but you definitely feel and get a sense of the interdimensional, the multidimensional, and the effectively the universality connectedness. And going to conclude where we started, that's exactly what the world needs now, because it has definitely been a period for too long that politics and religion and social views, and I guess where you fit on an orientation of one form or another, has all divided us as opposed to bringing us together. And to me, that's the role I think psychedelics need to play, is to demonstrate and to bring us back to at least some form of universality, which, that without that, how are we going to move forward?
Well said, Rob. That's a great way to wrap up our time here together. And wow, there's a lot to unpack, and I'd love to have you on again in the future. We could talk more about law, legalities. I know you're working on some different projects.
We need to do an Indigenous show with Corey and talk about that case, which we didn't even get into today. But happy to come on again. And
yeah, well, we'll definitely do some more stuff for sure, because I know you're doing a lot of great work in the field of with the Indigenous people, some MDMA work and things of that nature, and regulations. And as things change, always keep in touch and let us know so we can keep people up to date on what's happening in the legal realm. But you've always been a great proponent of the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. It's always been a pleasure to get to know you, have some fun, have some great conversations. And it's one of the things about the conference is the community, because it brings all people together, not just the academics and the doctors and everything else, but it brings together everybody, the seekers, the journeyers, even some of these underground people that we talk about who do great work as well. And it's just a great opportunity for people to learn more and meet people who they can talk to about maybe their experience, or maybe gather information on what they may be interested in doing, because there's a lot of curiosity out there, people looking for different solutions, because the typical pharmaceutical or traditional, not even traditional, the more Western or the more current medical system isn't working for a lot of these things. So it's a great opportunity to learn more and connect with more people. And I just want to thank you, Rob, always for your support and for being there and the great conversations, and not to mention the great laughs we have many times over the years. I always appreciate that. And of course, I want to thank you for It always is. And I want to thank you for your sponsorship of the conference this year. And I look forward to seeing you then and meeting your wife. And, of course, to thank all of our sponsors from Conscious Living Network to Cosmic Sister. We had Ad Lucem Law, which is your law corporation, of course. Filament Health, Therasil. We've got Awake Healer. We've got a lot of different people coming on board now, just from a sponsorship perspective, because it's something we've never done. And we just want to make sure that, we can support people who are doing, good work in the right way so that people can find different ways to make a difference and really live a better everyday life. Because as you mentioned earlier, it's our God-given right to, access these states of consciousness, these states of being. And I just thank you for the work you're doing on the legal side to keep everybody safe and change the laws in Canada. So, Rob, I thank you as always.
Thank you, and looking very forward to the conference. How many days away are we, Mark?
We are exactly 3 weeks away tomorrow. So we're looking forward to it. We still got room left. So if you're interested, anybody, take a look. We've extended our, excuse me, we've extended our discounts indefinitely. So our goal is to keep it affordable and accessible to everyone. So,
and will Banyan Books be there again this year?
Banyan Books is always there. They're our resident go-to book people, because we want to make sure that we can provide people, good quality information and books to read. Reuben George got his new book out. Colin's always great by procuring some of the best, most up-to-date books on psychedelics and plant medicines out there. So
I build my library every year.
Well, we look forward to seeing it grow again, and we thank Banyan Books and everybody who supports their work at the conference as well. All right, Rob, we're gonna roll. Until next time, everyone, take care of yourself. We hope to see you at the conference in a few short weeks. Bye for now.